Well, welcome everybody who's just joining us. We just had our prayers and we are ready to I was gonna say dive back in, but at the rate we go, I feel like maybe we're just sort of getting our toes wet. We do just a few paragraphs a week
You
here.
know what? I like that we just kind of go at whatever pace we want. And if we study Matthew until the end of time, then so be it.
Well, I mean, it won't be the end of time. We are making progress. We're not going backwards. If I am correct, I think we're on chapter 26 now. And mine is the plot to kill Jesus. So we definitely are.
Wow, we're just getting happy here.
Okay. I think I'm at 26.
Okay.
Which is quite a long chapter. Let's see. Maybe we read through Judas's betrayal. That's a nice chunk of things to talk about. So if someone would like to read, I guess 26 verses 1 through 16, if anybody would like to read that.
I can do it.
Okay, wonderful.
Matthew 26.
Matthew 26.
Okay, thank you.
Mine says the conspiracy against Jesus.
All right.
When Jesus finished all these words, he said to his disciples, "You know that in 2 days' time it will be Passover, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Man, that's blatant. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. And they consulted together to arrest Jesus by treachery and put him to death. But they said, "Not during the festival, that there may not be a riot among the people." Now, when Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster jar of costly perfume oil and poured it on his head while he was reclining at table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant and said, "Why this waste? It could have been sold for much and the money given to the poor." Since Jesus knew this, he said to them, "Why do you make trouble for the woman? She has done a good thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this perfumed oil upon my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Amen, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be spoken of in memory of her." Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that time on, he looked for an opportunity to hand him over.
Thank you. Well, that was a lot. I think when we're done, we should have a movie night and watch Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes, I would love that.
Because this scene, they do it so, I mean, in my opinion, they do it so well. He has a whole song, like, there will be poor, always pathetically struggling. Look at the good things you've got.
It would just be fun though.
It would be fun.
You know.
Maybe we should do that if and when we ever get to the end of Matthew.
Lofty
And
goals.
we'll live stream it too, so people can watch it with us. I'm sure we won't have any copyright violations for doing that. But so what do you guys think? I have a question, and I'm wondering, I have always heard that the woman doing this jar was a prostitute. Is that just my weird religious upbringing, or have other people heard the same thing?
I have never heard it read that way out of the Bible, but I've heard it interpreted it that way from the pulpit.
Yes, me too.
So
or in Bible studies.
I think that
I haven't looked, but I think it might be presented that way in another gospel too, therefore. possible
Okay.
comment. I'd have to
It's
look
just-
that up, and I'm not sure. So we'll have to look at that, but it might be that I think it's presented that way in another gospel. Yeah, so anyway. But
Yeah,
It makes me mad though, because it seems like so many of the women in the gospel that have anything to do with
I think they're
Jesus
all Christians that way.
are portrayed as a
Mhm.
harlot.
Yeah, I
Why-
don't think
I
any women
mean-
aren't.
And
Yeah, I was
maybe if that
curious.
is true, maybe that's because they see something better in Jesus than most men.
well, I have
Well, he would be
I
hard-
have a more cynical interpretation than that.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree, but I'm just trying to give them a break. I think the only woman in the Bible that's not a harlot is Mary Magdalene.
No, I've heard Mary
Oh,
Magdalene.
see,
was
I've
a
heard-
No, I mean, Blessed Virgin Mary.
Oh, I was like, no, I've had Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, Mary
Yeah, maybe
Magdalene.
and Mary's mom, but. It's funny.
And Mary.
So what do you
Okay,
guys?
I can't find it. If I can find my eye drops, would you give them to me in my right eye? I need to bring them. I can't feel the eye.
Do you have an eye?
What's everybody think? Thoughts? We've got a lot going on here. We know he's about to be arrested and crucified. We've got this anointment, which I think is a very beautiful scene. And then we've got Judas's betrayal.
It'll sit on your eye.
I think it's interesting that this particular passage
If I get it in my eye. or not.
Yeah.
used
I
judge
haven't.
Yeah, 'cause-
times used by certain
Yeah.
people in the church to justify not being too concerned with feeding and caring for the poor, that they use this, that Jesus says, well, the poor you will have all with you always. And they treat that as as if Jesus is making that as a statement of the way things ought to be, rather than
Yeah.
a condemnation of the way things are in the world. And it's a recognition. There is a priority here. Jesus is only going to be here so long, and we need to focus our priority on Jesus. Yes, but that doesn't do away with our responsibility to care for the poor. Doesn't do away with the way Jesus lived his life either. But yeah, so that I have heard the scripture used in that particular way. It's justification. Well, that's not really important. The only important thing is the gospel. Just fire insurance. Just save them from hell, and then everything will be okay.
Fire insurance. I like
I
that.
also think though that he's already asked them many times, who do you think I am? And they've already proclaimed that at least he's something greater than most people. So why are they upset that somebody is trying to adore him and
I'm trying to look up the other account, because sometimes we conflate the two things, trying to see where it is exactly. But in the other account, it's not all the disciples that are angry, it's Judas specifically.
right,
Oh.
right.
And it's very pointed in the other gospels, that other gospel, that Judas isn't doing that because he has any concern for the poor. He's doing it because he's a treasurer and he has the money, and he
Right.
doesn't want them. Yeah. So
And I think it's just unseemly. Like sometimes I think that I want to say it, I'm not sure how to say it exactly right. I'm like talking before I've thought it through, but it's never stopped me before. But I think sometimes in organized religion, like it's like we're gonna do this and we don't want to appear unseemly. Like we want to look dignified always.
Mhm, mhm.
Right? And that we somehow like conflate being like religious or spiritual or having faith with somehow being dignified. And which I'm not against at all. But I think sometimes he's saying, like, sometimes dignified's not gonna cut it.
Mhm.
And the fact she did this, it feels awkward, it feels too much, it feels open and vulnerable and messy, right? And I
Right.
think maybe that can be off-putting. Like if you've ever been to a service where people are on their knees or really like emoting,
Mhm.
it can feel very uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
And she's giving him everything. There's nothing dignified or seemly, or I guess Bishop Croy would say crazy Christians, you know,
Mhm.
she's being a really crazy Christian here, just pouring it all, literally pouring it all out for him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um,
So is this kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, though, do you think, for Judas? And why then the next thing he's going to the priests and offering his services?
yeah, I mean, it all sort of feels like this was all set in motion and was gonna play out no matter what happened.
Yeah.
You know, like a clock ticking down in my mind.
Yeah.
But again, I keep thinking about that scene in Jesus Christ Superstar where Judas is yelling at Jesus about this event. It's a good song.
I think there's such a conflict, and again, being raised Catholic, I obviously know more of how it comes up in the Catholic Church, but yes, she's being very liberal with her actions, but she's also being very costly.
Mhm.
Does the church have an obligation when the church tells you to take care of others? At what point are they required to cut their earnings? So you talk in the Catholic Church about, well, the church doesn't, but people sometimes do. The Vatican and the riches with the Pope, and the riches, how many, and learning more now how things are going, but in Catholics, the vow of poverty, the priests and the nuns take. But should you know what I mean? Like, so could we drop all this money on Jesus to be, you know what I mean? Like, when we're asking people who have less to give more, it kind of, I think this kind of talks that conflict.
Maybe this is kind of equal to back in the Reformation when you bought your way into heaven.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really, that was real. I think
Although
people
to
like to
me, I think
pretend that
she
wasn't real.
very sincere.
Well,
She was giving of her heart, I think, rather
And
than.
it was hers to give.
Yeah,
right, Jesus
right.
didn't say, do this to me or do this for me. She chose in her heart, this is how she wanted. And okay, so she didn't give it to the poor, but did she, by doing this action, did people see the action, and did it touch them in ways that would bring them to God? And you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
sometimes it's not just about giving money,
Mhm.
it's showing actions that can
And
do more.
and I
So-
might be wrong, but I think there's something too symbolic about anointing someone who's about to be killed.
Mhm.
Right? There's
Yes,
some
well,
symbolism.
I
still
looked it
do.
up, and I looked at, this is in all four gospels. And in Luke, it specifically refers to the woman as a sinner. And
Okay.
so that they extrapolate
Well,
that.
aren't we all?
Okay.
Yeah, and then it talks about in John, it's the one that says it wasn't all the disciples, but it was specifically Judas. And it talks about that the amount that this was worth was like 300 denarii. And the thing about this is, this was an expensive, incredibly expensive gift. And it was basically something this woman had saved for all her life and spent to be used on her own funeral when she died. These spices were used after you died to anoint the body and preserve it somewhat. This is part of the burial process. This is something she had saved for all this time. It was for her, and she shared what initially was supposed to have been for her out of her love for Jesus. And so that maybe gives us some context there of what's going on. But yeah, a lot of people, when people read these passages, they conflate all four gospels and they all give us different perspectives. But specifically is the one in Luke that talks about that the person who was there was a sinner. And then in John, it talks about that it was happened at the house of Mary and Martha. And it was Mary who was the one who anointed Jesus. So all these different details get put together to make up this account. And so if we take a look at the fact that this was a personal love offering from the person who did this to Jesus, something, that she was very costly and very, very very symbolic of how much she cared for Jesus, how much she loved him. And there was this symbolism also that it is primarily a burial, something that's done for burial purposes.
So David, this also brings me back to the fact that, well, I'm doing EFM, and right now we're reading Genesis, and the big emphasis on Eve being the sinner as opposed to Adam. They both sinned, and she's the big emphasis on her.
The woman.
And here, and then so then God declares that all people are going to be sinners after after this act. So
I think
in this time of in the Bible, are there degrees of sin? I mean, they're claiming this woman is a sinner, as we all are. So is she a worse sinner than the rest of us, or what?
no, I think you just need to understand this comes from out of a particular context, a historical context. Comes
Yeah.
from comes from a patriarchal culture. Number
Yes.
one, it comes from a patriarchal culture, and what I think that clearly these parts of Genesis are poetic.
Oh, yeah.
They're not meant to actually describe reality as it is. It's an attempt for Israel or the Hebrew people to explain not even so much the origins of the world, I don't think, but their own origins. And so in this attempt, as you say, they all sin. In fact, you look at the passage carefully. Adam was there the whole time. In fact, the snake was not just talking to Eve. It specifically says that they were both present. He uses a plural. So Adam supposedly had this superior knowledge. He knew. Did he not pass it on to Eve, or did he just watch while she was fooled? And when she was fooled, he wasn't fooled at all. He deliberately made the choice. And yet, as you say, all the blame is placed on Eve when Adam knowingly did this. And then when he was confronted, he tried to blame Eve. Yeah. So yeah, this is a very interesting passage. And I think that's what's going on a lot of times in the New Testament too, talking about as a sinful woman. And then through history, then it became common that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, and they tried to downplay, the way she was. I think it has a lot to do with the kind of society, the patriarchy they were in, and they were trying to make sure that Mary Magdalene, who was the first one who testified to Jesus' resurrection to the disciples, they didn't want her to get above herself. And I think there was some shenanigans going on here in terms of trying to put her in her place. So anyway, that's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. Anyway, not
a good opinion.
Yeah, so it's not, but anyway, and this same thing is happening here. I think that they're kind of trying to denigrate the person that did this. Even the authors of the Gospels have their own agenda in their turn. They're centering everything on Jesus, then on the disciples. In their culture, trying to center everything on the woman who, in this case, expressed her love for Jesus in such a concrete way, in such a loving way, much more than you see any of the men ever have done. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Anybody, any other thoughts? Are we gonna move on?
Well, we still have 25
We
minutes.
still do. We could, let's see, we could read Passover and Lord's Supper. That would give us some things. So how about 17 through 30? I'll read those.
Okay.
Craig Colombe's not here to point at me and volunteer me, but I'll volunteer. On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one after another, Surely not I, Lord. He answered, The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. Judas, who betrayed him, said, Surely not I, Rabbi. He replied, You have said so. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, Take, eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Well, my first thought is, how come if Judas, if he already had predicted that whoever's gonna dip with him was the betrayer, why did Judas let himself
Yeah,
fall
right.
into that and say, oh, well, I better not dip at all?
Kind of thought the same thing.
I think like,
I think it's important because it's human nature.
Yeah.
Like, how often have I said to myself, like, yeah,
I'm
that's
not
a
gonna
bad
do-
idea.
and you do
There
it
I
anyway?
am. I end up doing it anyway.
Yeah.
It just feels inevitable, all of this. I really do
Well-
in the background have this tick, 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 like you can't stop it. It's counting
Right,
down. I'm
right.
sorry, David, go
Yeah,
ahead.
also, we're not absolutely sure who heard what, so this was a big group there. If you know how people dined at that point, they dined reclining. It wasn't quite like the Last Supper that was printed, but they all kind of, laid against one another's breasts and kind of laid in one another's laps almost against each other in lines. And when Jesus said that, maybe he said it quietly to just some of them there. We're not quite sure how all that went down. But
Okay.
this is a pretty heavy-handed foreshadowing and painting Judas in a rather unfavorable light. But yet at the same time, there's one thing that's really interesting here to me, is that even though this was the prediction, when Jesus performed what we call now the Last Supper or whatever the rite, from all indications, Judas was still there, and he was still part of the ceremony, and he was still, part of the table, and that's really very hopeful to me. That
And very
even,
hopeful, you said?
yeah, that even the worst people, even someone who is going to betray Jesus still ministered to him the whole
Oh, I
time.
see.
He apparently knew, yeah, that he didn't restrict him. He didn't make sure that it was only the disciples that had been properly baptized or whatever were able to partake, but they were all part of this. This
Well,
symbolic act of showing what, talking about his crucifixion. They were all able to be part of that. Go ahead.
So-
I'm sorry.
I've heard in different debates about the theologians have about this particular event, is that some of them have said that Jesus and Judas were in collaboration for him to turn Jesus over, because Jesus knew
Somebody had
he
to.
was going to have to die. So, what do you think about that, David?
I think that I've heard that as well. That Charlie was talking about Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah.
And clearly the implication of that in other workplaces is that Judas wasn't trying to have Jesus killed.
Right.
Judas was trying to force Jesus to be the kind of Messiah that he wanted him to be, to take over. He was frustrated that he didn't take over during the triumphal entry and things like that. He was trying to force him to be a Messiah, like a Davidic Messiah that takes over the government and rules that way. And this was Judas' attempt to do that. I don't know. I'm not there. I don't know what to say, but yeah, that's certainly possible.
Are there any parts of the Bible where is Judas present at the times when Jesus is telling them, I'm gonna be crucified? Is he ever there at those times?
Well, he was a disciple and they
I
said
know, yeah,
that
but
he tells his disciples, I mean, I guess you couldn't. I
No,
don't
I'm
know any
just saying,
specific, but
you
you could
know-
infer he had been there through all that.
I understand that Judas, was trying to force Jesus' hand and he was gonna turn him
I-
over to hope, but Jesus kept saying, I'm gonna get crucified. And
Well, yeah, but did any of the disciples believe that? I don't think
Probably
any of them did. This was when Jesus was arrested and taken, they all just scattered, pretty
Right.
much. They didn't understand what was going on. Jesus may have said these things. At least it's presented that he does by the different gospel writers, but they're doing all this in retrospect. They're not doing it from where the disciples were. I think this was a big surprise to everybody. I don't think any of them clearly understand what Jesus was talking about. I think most of them expected him to take over and be the kind of Messiah that they were expecting. What Jesus did was totally beyond their expectations. Here he allowed, here he was, the Son of God, who allowed himself to be arrested and crucified. Crucifixion is terrible. And there's an Old Testament passage that talks about cursed is anyone who is hung from a tree. This, so this was the ultimate in a terrible way to die, debasement. That this just didn't seem to be. How could it be God's plan? Because this was a terrible thing to have someone to do. And then the whole church is founded on a concept that for them and for the Roman world, they only crucified the worst of the worst criminals.
Right.
And in places where the rebellion. And so the very idea that Jesus was God's son, Jesus was the Messiah, and yet he was crucified, was just unthinkable during that war. That is what Paul later calls the the shame, or of the gospel, the fact that God allowed himself to be crucified. That just was unthinkable.
It's such a powerful image.
Mhm.
I mean, I was, one of the things I think about all the time, besides Jesus Christ Superstar and the Richard Rohr sermon, the third thing I think about all the time is that Cynthia Bourgeault book that some of us hated. But she talks about this idea of like the constriction of God at that moment, that God would allow. And she said it's easier for her to believe in the reincarnation or the resurrection than it is for her to believe that God could die.
Mhm.
And just that you would willingly suffer that. It's
Right.
and I always, when I was first sort of like, do I like really examining my faith? And it's like, why? I would think this would like go against the idea that Jesus is God, that he died. Like that, he didn't
Right.
just take himself down. He didn't
You
just
you
like
could save everybody but yourself.
just mirror
Well,
something.
I
And
think-
then, yeah, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
I think the resurrection only makes sense in light of the resurrection. The crucifixion only makes sense in light of the resurrection. Yeah.
In the in between time when you don't know, right? In that moment where he's dead, that's
But
that's
this is the way the whole view of the world, and even the view we have of the world now, is turned upside down on its head. It's an upside down gospel that somehow that God is not trying to rule through power, strength over demand, but he's doing it through service. He's doing it through love even of your enemy, to the point that you are willing to die for them, your enemy, die for them. And then even in the moment of dying, say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I think this is the unique gift that we have as the church to give the world, is this kind of love that is so not self-centered, but it's so focused on the other that we're even willing to die for our enemies and treat those well that treat us poorly. That's the kind of love that God's talking about here. You know, it's just not doing good, but it's unfathomable. You know, it completely unfathomable to them. The only way we can partially understand it is we have Jesus as an example to show us what he did. And I think, yeah, I don't want to get too far into my sermon, but anyway, but
Amen, David. Amen.
It's
I love
hard. It's hard because it makes it be so selfless and for us, and we're all about being selfish. And it's hard to give as much as Jesus gave to us. It's hard.
Well, it's hard to give from the right place.
Right. Right.
Like I can give is like, oh, did anyone watch me do that?
Right.
Well,
It's like the two-
aren't I something
It's
today?
like the two guys that are in the temple praying, and one's in the front saying, "Look at me, God, I'm so great," and the other one's in the back just saying, "I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner."
But it's
Yep.
hard to give from that place of I'm just giving because of compassion.
Mhm.
I'm just giving because I feel so loved that I have this to give.
Right.
That's a hard,
Right. It is.
and it's not, oh, we're talking about discernment before. I think sometimes it's hard to know. I think you can feel like you're giving from a good place, and inside you're resentful that you're not getting anything back and not being appreciated. And
Mhm.
like for me, I'll just keep it on.
sometimes it's easy to give to those people that are like us and we love and are like they're in our church and they're people we meet all the time and they're a lot like us. And it's very easy to help those people, but then to go out and then go to the people that we don't either, you know, we're not comfortable with, or maybe some of the things they believe are really repugnant to us, and still reach out to them with the same love, that self-sacrificial love that's willing to die for them rather than inflict hurt on them. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a word. That is a word today I needed to hear. It's hard to stay in that place of love. I have to duck out of here just like 3 minutes early today, just because there's a,
Wondering if you're getting charity or
yeah,
are charity.
I'm getting hope. They just,
That's
it's a short day
okay, 'cause
for
I need to
them.
go use the bathroom.
But, we have,
I'm just gonna go.
okay, yeah, it's okay. You don't need a pass or anything. No, I'll write you one if it feels better. But I don't think I want to take another chunk on in the last few minutes. We could talk about this idea of communion. That's been a big deal lately at Grace, just because with a shortage of supply priests, it's not something we can offer every week right now. I mean, I hope that's changing soon, but the idea of communion is so different from different faith backgrounds. And I come from a place where maybe it was once a month, maybe, and it was more casual. And then I know Catholic background, it's much more structured and restricted. And then in the Episcopal Church, like according to the sort of the rules, you should be baptized before you have communion, but Greg always had open communion. But do people have, usually there's thoughts, anyone have thoughts to share?
You know, I was raised with not taking communion. I mean, again, a Catholic background, but you don't take communion until you understand what you're doing.
Mhm.
You know, giving a small child communion, Mom, I want the juice. I mean, you hear
Right.
it in the pews. I want the juice, but I'm hungry. And I had actually talked to somebody who used to be here long ago. And I said, I don't get, like, why, I just don't get it. And at the time I wasn't letting my kids have communion when we were here because they didn't understand what it was. And the way it was explained to me is the children at church don't understand what it means to receive communion, but they do understand what it means to be denied communion. So of course, the next week at church, my kids go, but Mom, and I thought, oh, should I deny it? Like, but that twist on it really, like, that resonated with me. No, they don't understand. And for us to assume those, well, the kids in that first pew are not so little anymore.
Mhm.
Just one is. I think most of them do understand, but at first you don't understand to receive. but you understand what it is to be denied.
Yeah,
And
that's interesting. We do have kids who don't take communion
Mhm.
and they get a blessing. I mean, that is a thing that happens, but they are still invited to the
to the communion
to
rail.
the rail and they still receive a blessing.
And I think it has to be a family decision. Regardless, the church allows or permits for, but the family and the individual needs to make the choice for it. Because there's a lot of reasons.
Yeah, there's a
To make
lot of very
decisions.
strong views around communion. And they all have like reasoning behind them.
Yeah, and respect different choices.
When I grew up, I was Episcopalian, and I was confirmed, and you probably go through confirmation in the Catholic Church too. And we didn't take communion until after we were confirmed, and we had gone through catechism and the classes to understand what it meant to take communion and who Jesus really is. And at that time, even then, I don't think it really went in to make me understand it. And I was like, what, 12 years old. I was in like 5th grade, and I didn't really understand what I was doing, but you just did it. I almost fainted or something when I went up to the bishop and got my, you have to go up and the bishop and get your head, your you get your blessing so that you can actually receive communion. And I still sometimes think, when does a child really understand it? But we do understand Jesus, that Jesus loves us and Jesus died for us. And we may not understand why or what happened, but we are taught that from kindergarten on, or, preschool or whatever, in Sunday school. And so when Greg started saying we could, because I asked Greg, for us when we first started, whether we could take communion, because I hadn't been in church for a long time, in the Episcopal Church, and David and Chris neither of them were Episcopalian. They were baptized, but they didn't have communion or, confirmation. And so I asked Greg, and he says, "Oh no, everybody's welcome." And I thought that was a really good thing, because I think, and I agree with you, Jackie, that, they understand what it means not to be included. And to me, every child needs to understand that they are accepted and they are included in God's kingdom.
Beautifully said, Leslie. I need to duck out, it's just about 11:30. I have to be somewhere in 15 minutes, but I don't mean to cut you guys short, but I'm
okay.
cutting you guys.
17 minutes, really.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. David, if there's anything you need before Sunday, let us know. We'll give you a little booklet and you can just read those parts, but
Yeah.
There's been variations on the theme. I think every mistake that can be
Yeah.
made has been made, so maybe you can find some new ones.
Yeah.
But we'll support you.
I'm doing the second reading, so if I can do
All right.
anything to help you out
Right.
with that.
All right, thank
I
you,
appreciate-
everybody.
I appreciate all that. I
Bye.
think as long as we're doing the passages that which reading are you doing, Carol?
Second. I don't know if there's nobody signed up for first yet, but
It always
Jackie
works
can
out.
do it.
I'm not gonna be
No.
here.
I've signed up to do it.
Oh, you have, okay.
Wonderful.
So you and me, Leslie, okay?
Yeah, David asked me, because he's going to be preaching on the first reading in the gospel.
Okay,
Well-
perfect.
Right,
We'll
Okay.
do.
Thank you,
Sounds good.
Bye,
everybody.
everybody. See you on Sunday.